What if one man's vision could transform chaos into order? In ancient Mesopotamia, between two mighty rivers, a king rose from obscurity to change civilization forever. Hammurabi, warrior, shepherd, lawgiver, unified warring cities through strategic conquest and brilliant diplomacy. But his true legacy was carved in stone. 282 laws that defined justice for millennia. Standing before the sun, god Shamash, he created history's first comprehensive legal code, declaring that the strong may not oppress the weak. Discover how this visionary ruler built an empire that crumbled, yet left principles of justice that outlasted kingdoms, religions, and time itself. Between two restless rivers stretched a land unlike any other. The Tigris and the Euphrates, born from the mountains of Anatolia, carried life and destruction in equal measure. In their floodplains, the earliest cities had risen like jewels set in mud and reeds, Uruk, Kish, and Lagash, each claiming the favor of its gods. By the dawn of the second millennium before Christ, this ancient stage had grown crowded with ruins and ambitions. Empires had come and gone, and the soil still glittered with the broken bricks of vanished kings. The collapse of the third dynasty of Ur around 2000 BC had left Mesopotamia in fragments. The last of the Ur kings, Ibisin, had seen his once great realm devoured by famine, rebellion, and invasion. To the west came Amorite tribes, pastoral people from the fringes of the Syrian desert, whose movements reshaped the heart of Sumer and Akkad. They spoke a Western Semitic tongue, but they quickly adopted the cuneiform writing, rituals, and temples of those they conquered. These migrants did not merely raid, they settled, ruled, and built. Within a generation, Amorite names crowned the thrones of nearly every city. In the ruins of Ur's bureaucracy, a patchwork of new powers emerged. The city of Essin claimed to be heir to the old empire, restoring temples and using the royal titles once reserved for kings of Ur. But its authority stretched thin. To the south, Larsa rose under its own Amorite rulers, controlling the trade routes that led to the Persian Gulf. In the north, Eshnunna and the powerful Assyrian line of Shamshi-Adad contested the river valleys. Between them lay smaller principalities, Sippar, Kish, Borsippa, and among them a modest settlement called Babylon. Historical traces point to Babylon's beginnings in the late 3rd millennium before Christ, when it was little more than a provincial town known as Babar, the Gate of the Gods. During the reign of the Akkadian king Shah Kalishari, a temple rose there to honor Marduk, a youthful deity of the storm and the sun, whose name would one day eclipse all others. By the age of Ur III, Babylon had grown into one of many administrative centers governed by officials loyal to the high kings of Ur. Clay tablets from that time still record the names of its local rulers, Aitur Ilum, Isur Ilum, and Abba, men responsible for collecting grain, repairing canals, and maintaining the fragile balance of irrigation. They commanded no empire, only a patch of fertile land where survival depended on the mercy of the rivers. Those irrigation systems were Mesopotamia's arteries. Canals drew the river's floods into the fields and drained their excess before the waters could drown the crops. A single breach could starve thousands. A single repair could secure a kingdom. Every ruler boasted of digging or restoring them, and with good reason. Control of water meant control of life. From these channels came barley and dates, the basis of the region's wealth. Herds grazed on the levees, and fishermen cast their nets in the flooded basins. Along these same waterways, merchants moved copper from the Gulf, lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon. Beneath the blazing sun, wealth flowed as steadily as the water that sustained it. When the Amorites settled, they did not dismantle this system, they inherited it. At Tel Hariri, the ruins of ancient Mari on the Euphrates, archaeologists uncovered archives that reveal the scale of this inheritance. There, hundreds of tablets describe caravans of grain, the shipment of oil, the dispatch of scribes, and the endless flow of correspondence between rulers. The Mari archives show a world that was literate, connected, and fragile. Alliances shifted like the river's course, and each city watched its neighbors with suspicion. By 1900 BC, this tension had hardened into a new order. Amorite dynasties ruled in Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari. Their kings called themselves shepherds of the people, echoing older Sumerian titles that cast the monarch as caretaker rather than tyrant. Yet each shepherd guarded his own flock with sharpened bronze. The landscape of Mesopotamia had become a checkerboard of ambition. To the south, Larsa under Gungunum and his descendants grew rich from the ports of the Gulf and the trade in precious goods. Its rulers rebuilt the temple of the sun, god Utu, and claimed divine sanction for expansion. To the north, Eshnunna dominated the Tigris Valley, controlling the roads that led into the mountains of Elam. And far beyond, the Elamites themselves, longtime rivals of the Sumerians, waited for a chance to strike across the eastern frontier. The once unified land between the rivers was now a theatre of perpetual rivalry. Amid these shifting powers, Babylon was almost invisible. Its early kings were Amorite chieftains who ruled a handful of villages and fields north of ancient Nippur. They fought skirmishes, raised walls, and offered gifts to Marduk to secure divine protection. Archaeological layers from this era show modest temples, not palaces, merchant seals, not royal inscriptions. Yet the city possessed one advantage no rival could claim: location. It stood near the confluence of vital trade routes between north and south, and at the crossing of the two great rivers' tributaries. Whoever held Babylon could watch both Sumer and Akkad. The collapse of Ur had left more than ruins. It had left a cultural memory of unity. Every Amorite ruler who came after sought to claim that memory, to present himself as the heir of the lost order. In temple inscriptions and hymns, they invoked the old gods of Sumer, Enlil of Nippur, Inanna of Uruk, Nana of Ur. But each added new epithets, new prayers, new symbols of legitimacy. Kingship in Mesopotamia was never merely political, it was theological. A ruler was chosen by the gods to uphold Kittim, truth and justice, the cosmic order that kept heaven and earth aligned. When a king failed, famine and war followed, seen as divine punishment. From this belief came the ancient obsession with law. The Sumerians had already written codes under Ur-Nammu and Lipit-Ishtar, setting out rules for property, labor, and reparation. Their purpose was not only to resolve disputes, but to show that justice was part of creation itself. In the centuries after Ur's fall, that tradition lingered like embers waiting for a new flame. Meanwhile, the Amorite newcomers brought with them a different energy: tribal loyalty, pragmatism, and a gift for adaptation. They learned the old writing system, but infused it with their own tongue. They revered Marduk, the local god of Babylon, but also drew upon the older pantheons of Sumer and Akkad. Over time, their language, Akkadian, became the common speech of diplomacy and law, replacing the ancient Sumerian tongue in most courts. The fusion of these worlds, Sumerian form and Amorite spirit, created something entirely new. By the early 18th century before Christ, Mesopotamia stood at a crossroads. The landscape was prosperous but fractured, fertile but tense. From Mari to Ur kings exchanged letters sealed in clay, speaking of alliances and threats, marriages and betrayals. Armies marched along the same canals that fed the fields, and cities fortified themselves behind walls of baked brick. Yet beneath the conflict, there was a shared longing for order, political, moral, and divine. In this world of competing gods and fragile treaties, one city remained small enough to be overlooked and secure enough to dream. Its priests tended the temple of Marduk, its scribes recorded the flow of grain, and its young prince was being taught the duties of kingship. From the terraces of Babylon, he could watch the shimmer of the rivers at dusk and the smoke of distant cities rising beyond the horizon. His name was Hammurabi, an heir to Amorite ambition and Sumerian tradition. Born into a world that needed law as much as it needed rain. And soon, from this quiet center between the two rivers, the balance of Mesopotamia would shift again. A new kind of ruler was about to emerge, one who would wield not only the sword, but the word, binding heaven and earth through the power of justice. Around 1810 BC, in the modest but rising city of Babylon, a child was born into a dynasty that had not yet learned the meaning of empire. His name was Hammurabi, son of Sin-Muballit, heir to a line of Amorite rulers who had carved their realm from the remnants of older powers. His birth was not greeted with divine omens or celestial signs in the chronicles, yet the age itself seemed ready for him. The lands between the rivers were restless again, and Babylon stood poised between obscurity and greatness. The Amorites, once wandering pastoralists from the western deserts, had by this time become city builders and kings. Their speech, related to the ancient tongues of Canaan, had blended with the language of Akkad to form the dialect of merchants and scribes. In Babylon, that fusion of traditions had already taken root. The city's temples honored both the gods of the old Sumerian pantheon and the new deity who was rising among them, Marduk, lord of storms and judgment. Around his sanctuary, the walls of Babylon began to thicken, its streets to widen, its ambitions to grow. Sin-Muballit, Hammurabi's father, was the fourth ruler of Babylon's Amorite dynasty. He was no conqueror of legend, but a careful architect of strength. From surviving royal inscriptions, his deeds appear modest: fortifications, canals, and temples dedicated to Marduk and Ishtar. But these works secured Babylon's standing in a region crowded with rivals. He expanded his control northward towards Sippar and Borsippa, extending his authority across the fertile lands along the lower Euphrates. His policies were pragmatic: steady trade, firm alliances, and the maintenance of internal peace. Yet even as he built, stronger powers circled beyond Babylon's horizon. To the south, Rim-Sin ruled Larsa, the wealthiest city of Sumer, whose dominance of the Gulf trade made it the envy of the region. Eastward, the kingdom of Elam hovered beyond the mountains, ever ready to intervene in Mesopotamian politics. Northward lay Eshnunna, commanding the routes to the Iranian plateau, and beyond it, the kingdom of Mari under Zimri-Lim, whose palace would later yield thousands of letters chronicling an age of intrigue. To rule Babylon amid such neighbors required a balance of diplomacy, watchfulness, and faith. The palace of Sin-Muballit was likely built near the great temple of Marduk, known in later times as Isagila, the house whose head is lifted high. From there, he governed a population of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen whose prosperity depended on the canals. The king's officials oversaw grain storage, tax collection, and irrigation maintenance, while scribes recorded each transaction on clay. Among these officials, Hammurabi would have received his earliest education. Royal sons were not raised in idle luxury. From childhood, Hammurabi was trained to read and write cuneiform, a skill reserved for the learned few. He studied the hymns of Sumer, the laws of Ur and Essene, and the rituals of the temples. In the schools attached to the shrines, he learned the sacred formulas by which kings communed with their gods. Lessons in mathematics and geometry were not for abstract knowledge, but for rule itself. The measuring of land, the calculation of rations, the design of canals. Every act of governance was bound to the divine order, and every error could offend the gods. Through these disciplines, the young prince came to understand the burden of kingship. Babylon was not yet a great city, but its destiny lay in its position. It stood on the seam between north and south, between Akkad and Sumer, between old traditions and new ambitions. Its walls were modest, but its temple was growing, and with it, the influence of Marduk. In inscriptions from this era, the god begins to appear as King of the Gods, a title once reserved for Enlil of Nippur. That shift in divine hierarchy mirrored a subtle political change, the rising confidence of Babylon's rulers. Sin-Mubalit's reign was not without struggle. Rim-Sin of Larsa pressed northward, absorbing the cities of Essene and Uruk and proclaiming himself master of Sumer. To resist, Sin-Mubalit entered shifting alliances with Eshnunna and Mari, trading gifts and pledges that rarely lasted more than a season. The Mari letters record this web of diplomacy. Envoys carrying tablets sealed in clay, promises of troops, exchanges of brides. In one message, a ruler calls for Babylon's support against Elam. In another, a Babylonian emissary negotiates peace with a rival. These fragments reveal a world of fragile loyalties, where each king sought advantage in the ruin of another. In such an environment, Hammurabi learned that survival required more than strength. It demanded patience and timing. His father's example taught that the sword alone could not hold a kingdom together. One needed law, faith, and the trust of the people. When Sin-Mubalit grew old, he abdicated in favor of his son, a gesture that suggests deliberate succession rather than crisis. The transition occurred around 1792 BC. Babylon had grown under his care, but it remained a secondary power, overshadowed by its wealthier and older neighbors. Hammurabi ascended the throne at about 18 years of age. The chronicles speak little of the ceremony itself, but in Babylonian tradition, a new king's first act was to proclaim remission of debts, to establish justice in the land. This gesture, known as Misharim, was both moral and political. It erased the obligations of the poor, freed those enslaved by debt, and reaffirmed the ruler's divine duty as guardian of balance. Hammurabi's first decree likely followed that custom, setting a tone that would define his reign. Newly crowned, the king inherited a city on the brink of change, its walls secure, its markets open, its god in ascendancy. Yet its territory was still confined to the central plain, hemmed in by the stronger powers of Larsa and Eshnunna. Hammurabi's early years were spent not in conquest, but in consolidation. He improved irrigation works along the Euphrates, repaired temple walls, and strengthened the administrative system that his father had built. These tasks, mundane though they seemed, created the machinery that would later sustain an empire. The city itself was changing. The temple precincts expanded, new quarters arose along the canals, and Babylon's merchants grew wealthy through trade in grain, textiles, and copper. The cult of Marduk flourished, drawing pilgrims from surrounding towns. Priests proclaimed that the young king ruled by divine favor, and in the ceremonies of the new year, Hammurabi himself would have taken the hand of Marduk's statue, symbolizing his covenant with the god. To rule Babylon was to serve its deity. To serve Marduk was to preserve justice. Beyond the city's gates, however, the region remained unstable. The power of Larsa still dominated the south. Eshnunna guarded the east, and Mari controlled the river routes to the north. Hammurabi faced them all with the caution of a young ruler surrounded by older, richer, and more experienced kings. For nearly a decade, he pursued peace through diplomacy, sending envoys to Zimri-Lim of Mari and exchanging assurances of friendship. During this time, he continued his father's work of internal development, draining marshes, building canals, and restoring temples long neglected since the fall of Ur. The echoes of those early projects can still be found in the surviving year names of Hammurabi's reign, each one commemorating a significant event. The year Hammurabi built the wall of Sippar. The year the throne of Marduk was fashioned in gold. These records, inscribed on thousands of tablets across Mesopotamia, were not mere calendars. They were a chronicle of achievements, a slow unfolding of ambition. Through them, one can trace the evolution of a cautious prince into a visionary monarch. By his 30th year, Hammurabi had secured the loyalty of his cities, reformed the tax system, and positioned Babylon as a stable, prosperous kingdom. Yet the balance of power around him was beginning to shift. Old alliances were faltering, and the mighty Larsa, once invincible, showed signs of strain. In distant Eshnunna, new rulers sought expansion, while Elam watched from beyond the mountains. The rivers that had long divided the land were again drawing its people toward conflict. From the quiet corridors of his palace, Hammurabi must have seen it coming. The same currents that had once carried grain and trade would soon bear armies and ambition. His years of preparation had laid the foundation, but the time of peace was ending. The young king of Babylon had learned the lessons of patience and order. Now he would learn the art of conquest. When Hammurabi took the throne, Babylon was little more than a rising voice among louder powers. To its north stretched the kingdom of Eshnunna, rich in trade and iron discipline. Eastward lay the highlands of Elam, where kings looked westward with envy. Farther north stood Mari under Zimri-Lim, a city famed for its vast palace and archives that would one day reveal the hidden conversations of kings. And to the south, Larsa ruled over Sumer's fertile heartlands, where Rimsin reigned as master of wealth and pride. Babylon, hemmed in by stronger realms, seemed destined to remain a provincial state. Yet Hammurabi understood that endurance could be as powerful as conquest. Instead of drawing the sword too soon, he strengthened the core of his city. Administrative reforms became his first campaign. He appointed trusted officials to oversee each district, ensuring that grain stores, taxes, and temple revenues flowed with precision. To curb corruption, he ordered frequent inspections of provincial records, a practice that would later define the efficiency of Babylonian governance. In the same years, Hammurabi invested in the arteries of the kingdom, the canals. Old waterways, clogged by neglect or warfare, were dredged and widened. New branches reached towns that had once been cut off from trade. The restoration of irrigation was not merely practical, it was ideological. In Mesopotamian thought, a king who maintained the canals upheld the balance between the gods and mankind. Floods and droughts were signs of divine displeasure. Steady waters meant harmony. As these works progressed, Babylon's fields turned green again, and the people began to see in their young ruler a shepherd rather than a warlord. Messages carried by messengers along the dusty roads connected Babylon to its neighbors. Through these channels, Hammurabi began weaving the delicate fabric of diplomacy. Surviving letters from Mari describe envoys moving between the two courts, carrying gifts, proposals, and veiled warnings. Zimri-Lim and Hammurabi addressed each other as brothers, bound by the rhetoric of kinship that masked calculation. One letter, written in Akkadian, speaks of shared enemies and mutual aid, though each line breathes caution. Alliances in this world were not built on trust, but on the rhythm of necessity. Rim-Sin of Lhasa, however, remained unmoved by such courtesies. Decades older than Hammurabi, he ruled over the south with near-imperial confidence. His victory over Itzin had given him control of Ur, Nippur, and the lucrative Gulf routes. Lhasa's merchants traded copper and grain across distant seas, enriching a court that gleamed with luxury. To many, Rim-Sin appeared invincible. His scribes recorded his triumphs on clay, proclaiming him favored by Utu, the sun god of justice. Babylon, in comparison, looked small, its walls modest, its influence confined. Still, Hammurabi watched and waited. He sent gifts to Lhasa, maintained polite correspondence, and learned from his rivals' methods. In those early years, Babylon was a student of its surroundings. The young king absorbed everything: how Mari governed its nomads, how Eshnunna taxed its merchants, how Lhasa disciplined its laborers. Each system offered a lesson, and each flaw revealed an opening. Trade became the lifeblood of Hammurabi's policy. He encouraged merchants to travel under royal protection, reducing tolls along the Euphrates routes. Caravans from the north began to stop in Babylon's markets, where goods from Anatolia met the produce of Sumer. With commerce came silver, artisans, and scribes. Prosperity spread slowly but steadily, and with it came influence. Neighboring towns, weary of war, began aligning with Babylon in exchange for stability. Temples, too, became tools of statecraft. Hammurabi restored sanctuaries neglected during previous conflicts, dedicating statues and offerings to local gods. In Sippar, he honored Shamash. In Borsippa, he rebuilt the shrine of Nabu. And in Babylon, he continued to elevate Marduk above the older deities. These projects were not acts of vanity. In Mesopotamia, every temple stood at the intersection of politics and faith. To rebuild a god's house was to claim his favor. To patronize many gods was to bind their cities to the crown. As these works advanced, Hammurabi cultivated an image of pious restraint. His reign's early year names, those short inscriptions summarizing each year's greatest act, speak not of battles, but of peace and restoration. The year Hammurabi strengthened the foundations of Babylon. The year he restored the Canal of Abundance. These phrases, carved into tablets across the land, built his reputation more effectively than any army could. They presented a ruler who sought balance, one who preferred order to conquest. This posture of patience masked a growing confidence. The same letters that carried greetings to Mari also carried intelligence. Reports from spies and merchants painted a picture of shifting fortunes. Eshnunna faced unrest among its vassals, while Lhasa's long reign was beginning to creak under its own weight. Droughts troubled the southern plains, and trade along the Gulf suffered interruptions. Even mighty Rim-Sin could not hold back time. Meanwhile, within Babylon's walls, Hammurabi refined the tools that would soon turn patience into power. He reorganized the army, integrating levies from conquered towns into disciplined units. Weapons were standardized: bronze-tipped spears, composite bows, and chariots drawn by onagers. The army's commanders were drawn from loyal families, rewarded with land and titles. Rather than keeping a massive standing force, Hammurabi relied on a flexible system of mobilization, ensuring readiness without exhausting the treasury. Internal justice also received new attention. Court records from the early years of his reign mention royal judges sent to provincial towns to oversee disputes. Their authority came directly from the king, bypassing local elites. This system reduced corruption and strengthened central power. In effect, Hammurabi was laying the groundwork for a legal network long before his famous code would be carved in stone. Law was becoming an instrument of unity as much as control. While peace reigned within, Babylon's influence began to radiate outward. Neighboring cities, impressed by its order, sought its mediation in conflicts. Tribes along the Euphrates pledged allegiance in exchange for fair arbitration. Step by step, without war, Hammurabi's name traveled farther than his soldiers did. He had become a figure of stability in an age of ambition. Beyond these achievements lay a subtler transformation. Babylon itself was changing character. The city that once mirrored Sumerian tradition was now defining its own. Akkadian became the common language of record, replacing Sumerian even in temples. The cult of Marduk absorbed the roles of older gods, gradually transforming him into the supreme deity of creation and judgment. In that transformation lay an implicit claim. As Marduk rose among the heavens, so too would Babylon rise among cities. Years passed under this quiet ascendancy. Across Mesopotamia, letters continued to pass between rulers, each written in the same courteous tone that concealed rivalry. But the alliances that once kept balance were beginning to fray. Old kings died. New ones inherited their thrones with untested hands. The Elamites pressed westward again, and the once powerful Eshnunna found itself entangled in disputes over tribute and border raids. The southern lands groaned under Rimsin's long rule, where decades of victory had turned to stagnation. In this shifting landscape, Hammurabi's patience would soon find its reward. Opportunity, long awaited, was approaching from every direction. The stage that had been dominated by others was beginning to open, and the young king of Babylon, who had learned from them all, was ready to step forward. The years of quiet preparation had forged a ruler of method and foresight. When the time came to move, he would do so with precision, turning diplomacy into weaponry and patience into conquest. The age of balance was ending. The age of Hammurabi was about to begin. The balance that had long kept Mesopotamia divided began to unravel. By the middle of the 18th century, before Christ, droughts and shifting alliances weakened the southern cities. Rim-Sin of Larsa, once the unchallenged master of Sumer, found his influence stretched thin across lands that no longer feared him. In the north, Eshnunna's ambitions drew it into conflicts with both Elam and Mari, while smaller kingdoms tried to survive between them. For decades, Hammurabi had strengthened his city without drawing the sword. Now the moment to act had come. His first campaigns were cautious, aimed at securing Babylon's immediate borders. Records from this period speak of victories over minor towns that had long paid tribute to Larsa or Eshnunna. Each conquest brought new canals, fields, and craftsmen under Babylonian control. Rather than destroying what he took, Hammurabi repaired, taxed, and absorbed. He allowed local governors to remain in place so long as they swore loyalty to him, a strategy that transformed enemies into administrators. The pace of expansion was steady, deliberate, and largely bloodless, at least at first. The fragile peace shattered when the Elamites, ever restless beyond the eastern hills, began meddling once more in Mesopotamian affairs. They supported rebellious vassals in Eshnunna and sought to reassert their old power along the Tigris. Hammurabi, who had quietly strengthened ties with Mari, seized the opportunity. Together with Zimri Lim, he formed a coalition to repel Elam's interference. The alliance was sealed not by ceremony, but by correspondence, an exchange of pledges preserved in the tablets of Mari. One message bears Zimri Lim's vow: "From this day until I die, I will be at war with the Elamite king." In 1765 BC, Babylonian and Mariot armies marched eastward. Hammurabi led his men in person, a king who fought at the head of his troops rather than from behind walls. His soldiers advanced along the canals, moving supplies by boat, and using the same waterways that had once carried grain to now carry war. Siege engines of timber and rawhide followed, pushed across the flooded plains. The campaign unfolded with precision. Cities loyal to Eshnunna fell one by one, their walls dismantled, but their inhabitants spared. By combining engineering with discipline, Hammurabi demonstrated that conquest could be an extension of order, not its opposite. Victory over Eshnunna and its Elamite allies transformed the political map. Babylon's borders stretched farther than ever before, and the northern trade routes came under its control. For the first time, Hammurabi's name appeared in year names beyond his own kingdom. Yet the triumph also revealed an uncomfortable truth. His ally to the west, Zimri Lim, now controlled much of what had once been neutral ground. Mari's influence grew, and with it, the question of whether friendship could survive power. For the moment, Hammurabi turned his gaze southward. Larsa, weakened but still proud, remained the final obstacle to unifying Sumer and Akkad. Rim-Sin's empire, once radiant, had grown brittle with age. The southern cities grumbled under his long reign. Fields suffered from overextension of irrigation, and trade slowed as the Gulf routes faltered. The time to strike had come. In 1763 BC, Hammurabi declared war on Larsa, invoking divine authority as justification. The gods, he proclaimed, had commanded him to bring justice to the land and end tyranny. It was a familiar declaration, yet this time it carried the full weight of Babylon's ascendancy. His forces moved swiftly down the Euphrates, seizing Aisin and Uruk in rapid succession. The capture of Nippur, the spiritual heart of Sumer, marked a turning point. By taking the city of Enlil, Hammurabi claimed not only territory, but legitimacy. Accounts of the campaign describe a combination of engineering and endurance. Babylonian troops built temporary dams to control river levels, allowing their boats to bypass fortified bridges. Siege engines, constructed from the same timbers that once served as irrigation scaffolds, battered the mud brick walls of Larsa's cities. The war was long but decisive. After months of siege, Rim-Sin's capital fell. Hammurabi spared the city from total destruction, ordering that its temples be cleansed and its debts remitted, a deliberate gesture to transform conquered subjects into citizens. The fall of Larsa was more than a military victory. It was a symbolic reunion of the two great regions, Sumer and Akkad, under a single crown. In temple hymns and royal inscriptions, Hammurabi was now hailed as King of the Four Quarters and Shepherd of the Peoples. The unification ended centuries of rivalry between North and South, but it also brought new challenges. Each conquered city possessed its own gods, customs, and legal traditions. To govern them all, the king needed more than soldiers. He needed an idea capable of binding them together. Back in Babylon, celebrations lasted for months. Offerings filled Marduk's temple, and processions carried statues of conquered gods to pay homage before him. These rituals were not humiliation, but assimilation. They proclaimed that the gods of other lands had willingly joined Babylon's divine order. Through faith as much as force, Hammurabi was shaping a single identity for his diverse empire. Reports from this period mention vast construction efforts to repair the damage of war, Irrigation channels reopened, temple walls were rebuilt, and new administrative districts were formed to manage the conquered territories. Each region sent grain, silver, and labor to Babylon, not as tribute from the defeated, but as contribution to a shared prosperity. Hammurabi's officials recorded these exchanges with the precision of scribes who understood that empire depended as much on writing as on weaponry. The Mari letters reveal glimpses of the diplomatic theatre that accompanied these conquests. Zimri Lim congratulated Hammurabi on his victories, yet behind the words lay unease. Babylon's rise threatened to eclipse Mari's influence, and mutual suspicion grew. Within a few years, their friendship would dissolve into open hostility. For now, however, the illusion of unity endured, and Hammurabi used it to consolidate his gains. As the southern cities adjusted to Babylonian rule, the king began integrating their bureaucracies into his own system. Local governors remained in office but reported to Babylonian overseers. Taxes were standardized, weights and measures unified, and temple records audited to ensure fairness. The empire that emerged was not stitched together by coercion alone, but by consistency. A merchant from Ur could trade in Sippar under the same regulations, confident that the same standards of justice applied in both places. Years of discipline and patience had brought Hammurabi to this height. Yet beneath the triumph lay an understanding that victory was never final. Every conquest added new complexities, every province new tensions. To sustain what he had built, he would need a system strong enough to outlast him. That system was already forming in his mind, an enduring framework that would transform divine will into written law. By uniting Sumer and Akkad, Hammurabi had achieved what few rulers before him had even dared to imagine. His empire stretched from the northern plains to the marshes of the Gulf, a domain greater than any since the fall of Ur. The wars that had begun as a defense of Babylon had become a reordering of Mesopotamia itself. For the first time in centuries, the land between the rivers spoke with one voice. Even so, the work of conquest was not yet finished. To the east, Eshnunna still smouldered with resentment. To the west, Mari watched with wary eyes. Hammurabi's empire was strong, but not secure. The unification of the land had been achieved by force. The unification of its spirit would require something deeper. Justice, written not in blood, but in stone. Peace rarely followed victory for long. The unification of Sumer and Akkad had reshaped the political order. But beyond Babylon's borders, old rivalries lingered. Eshnunna, that proud kingdom of the Tigris Valley, still refused submission. Its rulers, embittered by earlier defeats, saw opportunity in Babylon's rapid rise and sought to reclaim lost influence. To the west, Mari, under Zimri Lim, watched uneasily as Hammurabi's authority spread across the plains. Alliances that had once ensured survival now became chains, and the kings who had called each other brothers began to question the balance of power. Hammurabi understood that empire required unity, and unity demanded control. The victory over Larsa had given him prestige, but it also drew him into a web of new responsibilities. Southern cities expected protection. Northern allies demanded favors. Managing this vast realm tested even his seasoned administration. Yet he did not retreat into complacency. Reports of Eshnunna's renewed aggression reached Babylon, describing raids along the border and demands for tribute from towns that now owed allegiance to Hammurabi. The time had come to settle the question of dominance once and for all. In 1762 BC, the king marched eastward. The campaign began under the guise of restoring order among rebellious vassals, but its true purpose was the annihilation of Eshnunna's independence. Babylonian forces advanced with precision, following the same methods that had brought down Lhasa. Canals turned into roads for war, boats converted into mobile supply depots, siege engines built from the timber of conquered lands. The armies of Eshnunna resisted fiercely, but their defenses, built for raids rather than invasion, crumbled before Babylon's discipline. Within months, the city fell. Hammurabi's victory was decisive, yet his strategy extended beyond conquest. The defeated territories were absorbed rather than ravaged. Local governors were summoned to swear allegiance before Marduk's name, and their temples received new offerings from Babylon's treasury. The message was clear. Submission brought prosperity. Rebellion brought oblivion. By turning enemies into partners, the king transformed war into governance. But one ally remained to be dealt with. Mari, whose letters once pledged eternal friendship, now stood between Babylon and the western trade routes. Its ruler, Zimri-Lim, had fought beside Hammurabi against Elam and celebrated his triumphs. For a time, their partnership had seemed genuine. The palace archives of Mari record the exchange of gifts, gold, textiles, wine, and horses, and the constant stream of envoys between the two courts. Behind the courteous words, however, unease deepened. As Babylon grew stronger, Mari's independence appeared increasingly fragile. Zimri-Lim's scribes captured the shift in tone. At first, they praised Hammurabi as the righteous king chosen by the gods. Later letters reveal irritation, complaints about delayed payments, disputes over borders, and rumors of spies. Babylon's agents were everywhere, gathering information, mapping roads, and assessing defenses. What had begun as friendship turned into quiet rivalry. Hammurabi's patience had limits. Once Eshnunna was subdued, Mari's usefulness was exhausted. The alliance that had carried him through years of war had become a liability. With characteristic calculation, he prepared for one final campaign. There was no public declaration of hostility, no warning carried by envoys. The strike came suddenly, executed with the same efficiency that had characterized all his wars. In the spring of 1759 BC, Babylonian troops descended upon Mari. The city's defenders, confident that their former ally sought only passage, were taken by surprise. Within weeks, the palaces that had once dazzled travelers with their painted walls and cedar beams were in flames. Zimri-Lim vanished from history. Whether killed, captured, or driven into exile remains uncertain. What is known comes from the ruins themselves. Centuries later, when the sands gave up the archives of Mari, scholars uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, letters, decrees, and inventories that preserved a world now destroyed. They remain our most vivid record of the age that Hammurabi ended. The decision to destroy Mari was not made in anger, but in vision. Hammurabi saw that lasting empire could not rest on alliances. It had to be anchored in central authority, bound by law and divine mandate. To justify the betrayal, royal inscriptions proclaimed that the gods had withdrawn favor from Mari, commanding Babylon to cleanse the land of its corruption. Such language was more than propaganda. It was the means by which violence was translated into righteousness. Each conquest became an act of cosmic restoration, aligning the human realm with the will of heaven. After Mari's fall, Babylon stood unrivaled. From the mountains of Elam to the banks of the Euphrates, no power remained to challenge its supremacy. The city that had once been a provincial backwater now governed the ancient heartland of civilization. Trade flowed freely once again. Merchants traveled from the Levant to the Persian Gulf under Babylonian protection. The king's scribes recorded a flood of tributes, silver from the north, grain from the south, wool and copper from distant lands. The empire had become a living organism, its lifeblood carried through the arteries of the canals Hammurabi had restored. Victory, however, brought new questions. How could such a vast and varied realm remain stable? The older Sumerian cities had their own laws, temples, and customs. Akkadian settlements followed different codes. Amorite tribes still valued oral tradition over written decree. To hold them together, Hammurabi needed something greater than military might. He needed a unifying principle that would outlive his armies, a moral architecture as strong as the bricks of his walls. In the years following Mari's destruction, the king turned inward. His court became a center of administration and reflection. Scribes compiled reports from every province, disputes over land, theft, contracts, debts, marriage, and inheritance. Judges from the conquered cities were summoned to Babylon to explain how their laws worked. Priests interpreted these meetings as acts of divine inspiration, claiming that Marduk himself guided the king's search for justice. The idea was taking shape, an empire not merely ruled, but ordered by a single code. Hammurabi's titles grew accordingly. Where earlier rulers had called themselves kings of specific cities, he was now king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters, and king who made justice shine. These were not empty phrases. They expressed a vision of harmony, extending from the palace to the peasant's field. The unification of Mesopotamia was nearly complete, but to preserve it, Hammurabi would replace the fragile loyalties of conquest with the permanence of law. Across his domain, towns celebrated his victories with festivals and offerings. Yet beneath the joy ran a quiet transformation. Babylon was no longer just a capital, it was the measure of order. Its scribes wrote in a single language, its temples followed the same calendar, and its god, Marduk, was recognized as supreme across the land. The destruction of Mari had cleared the last rival to that vision. The rivers that once divided kingdoms now flowed through a single empire, their waters feeding the same fields and carrying the same laws. From this unity, Hammurabi began preparing his greatest work. The battles had been fought, the rivals subdued, but the true test of rule was only beginning. Power without justice was temporary. Justice, once carved into stone, could endure beyond kings and kingdoms. The shepherd of the people was ready to shape a law that would bind all under heaven's gaze. When the drums of war finally quieted, Hammurabi turned his gaze inward. The years of conquest had transformed Babylon from a city-state into the heart of an empire, yet power alone could not sustain it. Soldiers could hold walls, but they could not keep the peace of daily life. Now the king's task was to turn victory into order, and order into permanence. His reign entered a new phase, not as conqueror, but as caretaker. In the texts that survive from this era, Hammurabi often described himself as a shepherd. The title carried more than poetic weight. It expressed the essence of Mesopotamian kingship. A good ruler, like a herdsman, guided his people with strength and vigilance. He fed them, defended them, and corrected them when they strayed. This image appeared in hymns, year names, and temple dedications, forming a portrait of a monarch who ruled not through fear, but through duty. Administrative records from across the empire reveal the breadth of that duty. Hammurabi restructured the provinces he had conquered, replacing weak governors with capable officials loyal to Babylon. Each district maintained its own bureaucracy, scribes, tax collectors, and judges, but all reported upward through a single chain of command. Grain quotas, once determined locally, were standardized. Temple revenues were carefully audited, and the proceeds redirected to projects that benefited entire regions. The kingdom's wealth now flowed through a single system, a pulse beating toward Babylon. Water remained the foundation of that system. The same canals that had carried his armies now carried prosperity. One inscription celebrates the completion of the Hammurabi Canal, a vast channel linking the Euphrates to outlying farmlands. It turned arid plains into fertile fields and revived settlements long abandoned during the wars. Other records mention repairs to ancient waterways: the Tigris Canal, the River of Abundance, the Canal of Plenty, each one a testament to his devotion to the people's survival. In a land where life itself depended on irrigation, the maintenance of water was the truest form of justice. Beyond infrastructure, Hammurabi intervened in trade and taxation. Merchants were required to use fixed weights and measures, enforced by royal inspectors. Caravan routes were patrolled by soldiers to deter banditry, and the king's decrees regulated loans, contracts, and prices. These reforms stabilized the fragile post-war economy. Farmers regained confidence to plant, traders dared to cross borders, and artisans once again filled the markets of Babylon with their crafts. Prosperity became tangible proof of divine favor. Temples occupied a central place in this renewal. Hammurabi viewed them not only as houses of the gods, but as administrative centers that embodied the empire's moral order. Priests kept records of harvests, stored grain reserves, and mediated disputes. The temples of Sippar, Borsippa, and Nippur, all rebuilt or restored under his direction, functioned as nodes of communication, linking the spiritual and economic life of the realm. At their head stood the sanctuary of Marduk, the god whose rise mirrored Babylon's own. In the rituals of the New Year festival, the king took Marduk's hand in a solemn procession through the city. This act symbolized the renewal of the divine covenant that legitimized his rule. The people believed that when Hammurabi grasped the god's hand, he drew down cosmic order from heaven into the world of men. It was a drama of faith that united ruler and subject in a shared vision of harmony. Every irrigation project, every decree, every judgment became part of that sacred duty. Royal year names from this period read like a chronicle of care. The year Hammurabi restored the Canal of Plenty. The year the walls of Sippar were rebuilt. The year the throne of Marduk was adorned with gold. Each phrase recorded a tangible act of restoration, echoing the rhythm of a kingdom rebuilding itself. For the common people, farmers, merchants, and laborers, these names were more than words. They were signs that the world was healing after decades of chaos. Daily life across the empire reflected that recovery. In the markets of Ur and Lhasa, merchants once again bartered for wool, dates, and copper. Farmers harvested their crops under the watch of temple officials, paying a portion of their yield as tax. Scribes busied themselves in workshops, pressing styluses into fresh clay to record contracts and payments. Justice, for the first time in generations, was predictable. Even those who had once fought against Babylon now found security in its laws. This stability allowed art, literature, and learning to flourish. Scribes copied old Sumerian hymns and composed new ones praising Hammurabi as the restorer of peace. The scribal schools of Babylon trained a new generation, fluent in both Sumerian and Akkadian, ensuring continuity of culture. Clay tablets from this time include proverbs, legal cases, and mathematical problems used in instruction. The fusion of Sumerian scholarship and Amorite pragmatism produced a civilization more unified than any before it. Despite prosperity, the king did not allow his officials to grow complacent. Correspondence from provincial governors shows that he demanded regular reports and punished negligence harshly. In one letter, an administrator begs forgiveness for a delayed grain shipment, blaming floods and illness among the workers. The tone is fearful but respectful, an acknowledgement that the king's attention extended to the smallest detail. Hammurabi's authority was distant yet intimate. His hand felt everywhere, though rarely seen. While temples and irrigation kept the material world in order, law maintained the moral one. Hammurabi personally reviewed cases that reached the royal court, setting precedents that his judges would follow. His decisions often combined mercy with exactness, compensation for the wronged, restitution for losses, and punishment for deceit. These rulings, collected and studied by scribes, formed the raw material from which his future code would grow. Justice, in his view, was not abstract. It was an act performed daily, as essential to survival as water itself. The balance he cultivated was delicate. Too much leniency invited corruption. Too much severity bred resentment. His genius lay in moderation, in the ability to make justice seem both divine and human. When he cancelled debts after floods or reduced taxes during famine, the people praised him as their protector. When he punished officials for abuse of power, they saw in him the god's righteous hand. Every decision reinforced the image of the shepherd king, gentle when he could be, unyielding when he must. Babylon itself reflected this transformation. The streets once crowded with soldiers, now filled with merchants and pilgrims. Temples gleamed with new plaster. Markets rang with the clatter of trade. From the ziggurat summit, one could see canals stretching into the horizon, their waters glittering in the sun. To travelers arriving from distant lands, Babylon appeared as the earthly mirror of divine order, a city where peace was visible. Still, beneath the calm, Hammurabi's ambition remained unbroken. He had mastered the art of rule and restored prosperity, but he sought something greater than stability. His reign would not be remembered merely for conquest or wealth. It would be remembered for defining the very meaning of justice. To give his empire a single heartbeat, he needed a law that all could recognize as sacred and fair. In the coming years, that vision would take form, a monumental code that gathered centuries of custom into one voice. The shepherd of the people would soon become the lawgiver of the world, carving his promise into stone so that no generation could forget it. Justice, for Hammurabi, was no longer just an act of judgment. It had become the cornerstone of empire. His victories had united cities and tribes, but he understood that swords and decrees could not hold them together forever. What bound a people had to reach deeper than fear. It had to touch belief. The time had come to transform his sense of order into something that would outlive him. The idea was not entirely new. Centuries earlier, the kings of Ur and Isin had issued collections of laws. Ur-Nammu's code, Lipit Ishtar's reforms, each proclaiming fairness and divine favor. Those earlier rulers had sought to protect the weak from the strong, to define theft and marriage, debt and restitution. Their words were written on clay tablets and read aloud in temples, but their reach had been limited to single cities or regions. Hammurabi's vision was larger. He would gather every tradition, refine every precedent, and forge a single standard for the entire land between the rivers. In Babylon, scribes began the monumental task of collecting local laws. Messengers carried orders to distant provinces, instructing governors and temple judges to send records of their customs and verdicts. From Ur came rules about property and inheritance. From Isin, laws on trade and taxation. From Eshnunna, precise tariffs on goods and labor. Scribes copied them onto fresh tablets, sorted them by subject, and laid them before the king. Day after day, Hammurabi reviewed the materials with his advisors, priests of Marduk, senior judges, and scholars trained in the traditions of both Sumer and Akkad. The process was as much theological as administrative. In Mesopotamian belief, justice flowed from the gods to the king, and from the king to his people. Hammurabi, as Marduk's chosen, was the conduit through which divine truth entered human life. To codify the laws, therefore, was to give physical shape to the will of heaven. Each decision, each penalty or exemption had to reflect the balance that the gods themselves maintained in creation. Scribes at the royal court worked in teams, writing on damp clay that dried into permanence. They used Akkadian, the common language of diplomacy and trade, so that every corner of the empire could understand the text. Some laws were drawn directly from older codes. Others were shaped by royal cases Hammurabi had judged himself. Together, they covered every aspect of life: agriculture, commerce, marriage, inheritance, assault, and theft. Yet the intention was not merely to regulate, it was to proclaim a moral vision. The law would show that power served justice, not the other way around. This undertaking reflected the intellectual vigor of Babylon at its height. The city's scribal schools, long devoted to copying hymns and myths, became laboratories of law. Students practiced by rewriting earlier statutes, testing different wordings for clarity and precision. Their clay exercises, preserved by chance, reveal the language of an empire learning to speak in legal form. Hammurabi's own presence loomed over the work. His officials referred to him as the king who causes righteousness to prevail, a phrase that would later open the prologue of his code. The content of the laws revealed both idealism and pragmatism. Rules about property protected farmers from encroachment by wealthier neighbors. Penalties for false accusation safeguarded personal honor. Provisions for merchants and builders encouraged honesty in trade. At the same time, distinctions of class remained. The awilu, or free man, the mushkenu, or commoner, and the wardu, or slave. Justice was proportional, not equal. The same crime carried different punishments depending on one's rank, reflecting a social order the king saw as divinely ordained. To modernize, it may seem harsh, but in its time, it was a declaration that every class, high or low, had a place under the same law. Religious symbolism infused the entire project. Temples served as both archives and courts, and priests participated in the discussions that shaped the code. The image of Shamash, the sun god of justice, appeared frequently in the seals and carvings that accompanied official documents. In later generations, artists would depict Hammurabi standing before Shamash, receiving from him the rod and ring, the symbols of divine authority. This motif captured the spirit of the moment, law as light, descending from heaven to illuminate the world of men. As drafts accumulated, the code took on a structure that reflected both logic and ceremony. A prologue declared Hammurabi's divine appointment, chosen by Marduk to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and evil, and that the strong may not oppress the weak. Then followed hundreds of laws arranged by theme: property, family, commerce, crime. A closing epilogue promised blessings to those who upheld justice and curses upon those who perverted it. The entire text read not only as legislation, but as prayer, binding law to faith. The king's court must have buzzed with the energy of this enterprise. Clerks carried tablets from one chamber to another. Priests debated the exact phrasing of oaths. Messengers rode out to announce new edicts. Each step brought the abstract closer to reality. The final form would not remain a collection of loose tablets, but would be carved upon a single monument. a stele of enduring stone. Hammurabi wanted the law to stand in public view, visible to all who entered Babylon, so that no man could claim ignorance of justice. Choosing the right material and form became part of the symbolism. Stone, unlike clay, could not easily be erased or altered. The artisans selected dark basalt, hard enough to resist time. On its surface, they would inscribe nearly 300 statutes in wedge-shaped script, and at the top, they would carve the king himself, standing in reverence before Shamash. It would be both document and declaration, a covenant between ruler and ruled. Before the carving began, the completed text circulated among temples and provincial offices for review. Copies made their way to distant cities, where judges studied them and offered local commentary. This consultation ensured that the laws reflected not just Babylonian custom, but the shared wisdom of all Mesopotamia. By uniting these traditions, Hammurabi transformed law from a local instrument into a universal principle. In the royal palace, preparations for the unveiling began. Priests composed hymns praising Marduk and Shamash as guardians of truth. Scribes rehearsed readings of the prologue, which would be proclaimed before the people. The great stele would soon be raised in the temple courtyard, where sunlight could strike its surface each morning, a daily reminder that justice, like the sun, rose anew with every dawn. Through this creation, Hammurabi redefined kingship itself. The warrior who had conquered cities now ruled as lawgiver and moral authority. His reign no longer depended on the uncertainty of war or the shifting loyalties of governors. It rested, instead, on something unbreakable, written words that carried the weight of divine order. The code was nearly complete. Only the stone remained to be carved, the final act that would transform the king's ideas into an image for the ages. Soon, the people of Babylon would see their ruler not only as a conqueror or shepherd, but as the voice of justice made visible, a man who turned the will of the gods into law. At the height of his reign, Hammurabi summoned artisans, scribes, and priests to the great temple complex of Babylon. There, under the eye of Marduk, they prepared the monument that would outlast empires. The work was not a simple inscription, but a statement of divine authority carved into eternity. When the basalt was set upright in the temple courtyard, it stood taller than a man and darker than the river at dusk, a pillar of justice, polished until it caught the morning light. At its crown, the sculptors carved an image that became one of history's enduring symbols. Hammurabi stood before Shamash, the sun god of truth and righteousness. Rays flared from the god's shoulders, and in his hands he held the rod and ring, the measures of justice and kingship. The king raised his right hand in reverence, receiving from the divine source the authority to govern. To any Babylonian who looked upon it, the message was unmistakable. The laws below were not inventions of men, but the reflection of cosmic order. Beneath this sacred tableau stretched columns of text, tightly etched into the basalt's smooth surface. Nearly 300 provisions filled the space, arranged with careful logic. Each law began with a conditional, if a man does this, and concluded with a consequence. Together, they formed a rhythm, a litany of cause and effect that defined the moral architecture of Hammurabi's world. The prologue at the top proclaimed the king's purpose in words that would echo through millennia. When the exalted Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, gave to Marduk dominion over mankind, they called upon Hammurabi, the prince of justice, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong may not oppress the weak. Those lines, inscribed with reverence, bound the human and divine in a single act of order. Each section of the code revealed a society both practical and moral. Laws governed property rights, contracts, wages, and family obligations. Builders were held accountable for the safety of their work. Merchants were bound to honesty in trade. Doctors received payment for success and punishment for failure. The famous principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, did not symbolize vengeance but proportion. Justice was to be measured, not wild. Harm was to be answered by equal restitution, not excess. In a world of hierarchy, fairness lay in balance, not equality. Family law occupied a central place. Marriage was a social contract regulated by clear rules. Dowries protected women's property. Divorce required compensation. Inheritance passed according to strict precedents. Even the rights of widows and orphans were carefully described, reflecting the king's promise to shield the vulnerable. For all its severity, the code expressed a consistent aim to make justice visible in every household, every field, every market stall. Trade regulations revealed Babylon's economic sophistication. Interest rates, shipping agreements, and loan conditions were set to prevent exploitation while maintaining accountability. If a merchant lent silver to a farmer and flood destroyed the crop, the debt could be postponed but not forgiven, a delicate compromise between mercy and order. Each clause balanced compassion with responsibility, ensuring that society functioned even under strain. The code's criminal statutes showed a similar logic. Theft, fraud, false testimony, and neglect of duty all carried penalties, often harsh, yet always specific. Where earlier traditions left judgment to the discretion of elders, Hammurabi's code fixed the measure of punishment in writing. No man could claim ignorance of the law or bend it through influence. The king had drawn a clear boundary between chaos and civilization. Religious offenses carried their own gravity. To cheat in a temple transaction or perjure oneself before a god was not merely a civil crime, but a sin against the cosmic order. Such acts could invoke the river ordeal, a ritual trial in which the accused plunged into sacred waters. Survival proved innocence. Drowning confirmed guilt. These rituals, mentioned in the code, reflected the belief that divine forces would reveal truth when human wisdom faltered. The text's organization itself was an achievement. Scribes grouped the laws by subject, creating one of the earliest systematic legal frameworks. Property and trade came first, followed by family matters, labor, injury, and public order. The sequence moved from private to communal life, mirroring the expansion of justice from the household to the empire. At the end, an epilogue invoked blessings upon future kings who upheld the code and curses upon any who dared to alter it. Hammurabi's words declared, "May the great gods who have ordained my rule curse his dynasty, overthrow his throne, and scatter his people." Once completed, the stela was placed in the heart of Babylon, where citizens could behold it during festivals and legal proceedings. Priests read its prologue during ceremonies, and judges consulted its provisions when hearing disputes. Copies were made and sent to distant temples, ensuring that the same standard governed the entire realm. For the first time, a law written in one city bound the lives of people hundreds of miles away. The monument's physical presence reinforced its moral message. Sunlight struck its polished surface at dawn, symbolizing enlightenment. By night, torchlight revealed the god's rays carved in relief. Travelers who entered Babylon passed near it, seeing the image of their king in perpetual communion with the divine. Even illiterate citizens could read its meaning through the sculpted scene. Justice flowed from heaven to the throne, and from the throne to every subject beneath the sun. Centuries later, long after Babylon's first empire had fallen, the stellar's journey continued. Carried away as spoils of war, it was taken east to the city of Susa by an Elamite conqueror. There it lay buried for more than 2,000 years, hidden beneath the ruins of another civilization. In 1901, a team of French excavators unearthed it from the dust of ages. When the light of day touched the basalt again, the carved words of Hammurabi re-emerged almost unscathed, a voice speaking across 4 millennia. That rediscovery restored not only an artifact, but a vision of order. Scholars deciphered its cuneiform lines and recognized in them the ancestor of later systems of law. The stela revealed how deeply the Mesopotamians believed that justice was divine geometry. Every action weighed, every consequence measured. Even in its exile and rediscovery, it remained a symbol of permanence, proof that the ideals of one age could survive the collapse of all others. Within Hammurabi's own time, the unveiling of the code must have felt like the crowning act of creation. The empire now possessed a visible heart, a standard that transcended conquest. The king who had ruled by might had become the ruler of minds and consciences. His people could look upon the stone and know where right ended and wrong began. The courts of Babylon began to apply the code almost immediately. Judges, acting as servants of the king's justice, cited its provisions when delivering verdicts. The presence of a written standard reduced disputes between officials and temples, merchants and farmers. Though not every case followed the code exactly, it remained a symbol more than a statute book. It provided a common moral language. Even those who never saw the stela felt its influence in the fairness expected from royal courts. In the quiet after its dedication, Babylon stood transformed. The same city that had once trembled under rival kings now rested upon a foundation of shared order. Hammurabi's empire, unified by law, radiated confidence. Its canals glittered, its temples thrived, and its scribes recorded the daily life of a people who believed their king had captured the will of the gods in stone. The monument in the temple court stood unmoving, yet it marked a turning point in human history. Where others had ruled by conquest, Hammurabi ruled by inscription. His words did not fade with the seasons or the changing of dynasties. They endured, carved into basalt, waiting for centuries to pass before being found again. Through the law, the shepherd had fulfilled his purpose. Through the stela, the mortal had joined the divine. In the years following the unveiling of Hammurabi's code, Babylon entered an age of order unlike any the land had known. The wars that had once torn the plains were replaced by steady rhythms of harvest, trade, and judgment. Justice no longer depended on the will of local rulers or the whim of powerful men. It was written, visible, and universal. Across Sumer and Akkad, from the temple courts of Ur to the caravan stations of Mari's ruins, the king's laws defined daily life. Babylon's scribes ensured that those laws reached every corner of the empire. Clay tablets inscribed with the articles of the code circulated among provincial officials. Judges memorized its clauses, quoting them during proceedings as if reciting scripture. When disputes arose, plaintiffs stood before them beneath tablets of cuneiform law hung in public halls. The very act of judgment had become a ceremony of legitimacy, binding citizens to the throne through the promise of fairness. For merchants, the code brought a new sense of confidence. Trade caravans moved through the Euphrates Valley under royal protection, their contracts sealed according to the rules Hammurabi had fixed. A lender could charge interest only at the rate prescribed. A borrower who defaulted lost property, not freedom. Partnership agreements required witnesses and written documentation. These measures reduced corruption and stabilized the marketplace. The prosperity that followed was not chance. It was design. In the workshops and fields, justice was equally precise. Law 215 declared, "If a physician makes a large incision with the bronze knife and heals the patient, he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. Yet if the operation failed and the patient died, the surgeon's hands could be cut off." To later generations, such retribution may seem brutal, but in Hammurabi's empire, it represented accountability. Every profession, builder, boatman, shepherd, or scribe, carried both privilege and peril. Farmers, the backbone of the realm, found protection in the same code. If floods or drought destroyed their crops, debts could be postponed. Tenants who rented fields faced penalties for neglect, but landlords could not seize their tools or enslave their families. The system encouraged responsibility while preventing exploitation. Across the floodplains, where water determined survival, the fairness of these laws was remembered long after Hammurabi's death. Family life reflected the same balance of structure and mercy. Law 142 read, "If a woman rejects her husband and declares, 'You will not have me,' her case shall be examined, and if she is found blameless, she shall go to her father's house, taking her dowry." That clause, unusual for its time, acknowledged a woman's right to appeal for justice. Marriage was still a contract, but the code gave wives limited autonomy and guaranteed protection for widows and orphans. The household, like the state, was built upon written order. Class distinctions shaped every aspect of law. Free citizens, the Awailu, enjoyed rights that commoners and slaves did not. Yet all three classes were included in the system. For crimes between equals, restitution followed the principle of equivalence. A broken bone repaid by a broken bone, a lost eye by a lost eye. Between ranks, penalties adjusted according to status. If a noble struck a commoner, he paid compensation. If a commoner struck a noble, he faced punishment. The goal was not equality, but balance, a world in which hierarchy and justice coexisted without contradiction. In the temples, priests acted as both spiritual and legal authorities. Oaths were sworn before divine statues, often of Shamash, god of truth. The accused might touch the idol's feet or pour libations as they spoke their defense. To lie in such a setting invited divine wrath. Some cases invoked the river ordeal, a ritual trial preserved from older times. When evidence failed, the accused leapt into sacred waters. If he survived the current, the gods had judged him innocent. If he drowned, his guilt was confirmed. These ordeals, both terrifying and sacred, reflected the belief that law was a bridge between men and gods. Courtrooms themselves were scenes of both drama and discipline. Litigants stood before panels of judges, each flanked by scribes who recorded the proceedings. Witnesses recited testimony from memory, and verdicts were announced aloud before the assembly. Fines were paid immediately, often in silver, grain, or livestock. Those unable to pay might labor temporarily for their creditor, but could not be enslaved for life. Every act was written down, stamped with seals, and stored in temple archives. Through these thousands of tablets, contracts, confessions, receipts, modern historians glimpse the living pulse of Hammurabi's empire. Evidence from these records reveals that ordinary people understood and used the code. Farmers cited it in disputes over irrigation. Merchants referred to it in trade agreements. Wives invoked it in divorce claims. Babylonian law was not distant, it was participatory. The written word, once the privilege of kings and priests, had become the common language of fairness. Royal oversight reinforced that confidence. Inspectors, known as Eyes of the King, travelled between cities to ensure that justice was carried out without corruption. They reviewed cases, audited temple accounts, and removed judges who accepted bribes. The administration was vast but disciplined. It was said that a single decree could reach the outer provinces within a week, carried by relays of mounted messengers. Even the remotest towns felt the authority of the crown through the rhythm of law. The reach of Hammurabi's justice extended beyond courts into everyday conduct. Builders who cut corners faced ruin. Merchants who altered weights risked confiscation of their goods. Servants and slaves had the right to petition for freedom if abused, and masters who killed them without cause faced punishment. Though harsh, the system created a framework of trust that allowed commerce and agriculture to flourish side by side. In cities once divided by rival gods, temples now coordinated through shared ritual calendars and legal customs. The worship of Marduk, Shamash, and Ishtar was celebrated across the realm, their temples acting as both spiritual centers and courts of record. Justice had become religion's companion. The king's role as lawgiver elevated him beyond mortal kingship. He was the earthly reflection of divine order, the sun that brings light to the land of Sumer and Akkad. For ordinary Babylonians, justice was no longer abstract. It was heard in the market disputes settled at dawn, seen in contracts sealed with bitumen and reed, and felt in the predictability of life itself. A farmer knew how much he owed, a merchant knew what he risked, and a craftsman knew the worth of his work. The clarity of the law created peace of mind more powerful than any garrison. Still, the code did not erase suffering. Inequality persisted, and punishment could be severe. Yet within those boundaries, Hammurabi's people found a sense of fairness that endured. They lived within a world that promised consequence and reward, where every action had its measure. The idea that law was both divine and human, etched in stone and enacted in daily life, became their inheritance. Babylon's streets echoed with that rhythm. Children carried small tablets to scribal schools, learning to write the same wedge-shaped symbols carved on the great stela. Merchants prayed before journeys, asking the gods to bless honest dealings. Judges opened proceedings with offerings to Shamash, calling upon his light to reveal truth. Across the empire, justice was no longer the preserve of rulers. It had become the shared faith of a civilization. Through this fusion of faith, order, and daily routine, Hammurabi achieved what his armies alone could not: a lasting unity. His code gave meaning to victory, turning conquest into community. The words carved in basalt found their reflection in every transaction, every oath, every act of fairness. Law had become the breath of Babylon, unseen yet everywhere. To understand why Hammurabi's law endured, one must look beyond the courts and the clay tablets to the world of the gods. In Babylon, law was never only a human creation. Every decree, every punishment, every remission of debt was rooted in divine will. The boundary between justice and worship did not exist. The temple was a courthouse, and the judge's verdict echoed the will of heaven. At the heart of this union stood Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. His rise mirrored the city's ascent. Once a lesser god among the pantheon of Sumer and Akkad, he became, under Hammurabi's reign, the supreme ruler of heaven and earth. Priests proclaimed that the older gods, Anu, Enlil, and Ea, had granted Marduk their powers and authority. Through him, Hammurabi ruled, and through Hammurabi, Marduk's order spread across the land. This theology gave every act of government a sacred dimension. To obey the law was to honor the divine hierarchy that sustained the universe. Temples across Mesopotamia were both centers of worship and hubs of economic life. Their vast courtyards bustled with scribes, merchants, and laborers, as much as with priests and singers. Granaries stored the tithes of farmers. Treasuries held silver lent to traders. Archives preserved contracts, inventories, and court decisions. Temples acted as banks, landlords, and record keepers, spiritual and practical institutions bound together. The same priests who offered sacrifices at dawn might, by afternoon, supervise the weighing of grain or the signing of legal documents. In this environment, law and faith intertwined seamlessly. When two men entered a temple to settle a dispute, they stood before the statues of the gods as witnesses. Oaths taken in such settings carried more force than any human guarantee. A merchant swearing by Marduk risked not only dishonor, but divine punishment if he lied. The formulas were carefully phrased, invoking deities as guarantors of truth. One common oath ran, "By Shamash and by Marduk, if I have deceived, may my life be forfeit." Such words carried weight in a world where the gods were not distant abstractions, but living presences. Rituals of judgment often involved symbolic tests. The most famous was the river ordeal, mentioned explicitly in the code's early laws. When evidence failed or witnesses contradicted each other, the accused might be sent to the river to prove innocence. He would plunge into the current, trusting the gods to decide his fate. If the waters carried him safely to the opposite bank, the gods had spoken in his favor. If he drowned, justice had been served by divine hands. The ordeal was not superstition, but an expression of faith, that cosmic order, not human reasoning alone, governed truth. Justice was thus a sacred drama enacted daily. In the temple of Shamash at Sippar, priests performed ceremonies to renew the bond between light and law. The god's golden disc, carried from its shrine each morning, symbolized the sun that illuminated both the world and the hearts of men. Shamash was believed to see everything, his rays penetrating all deceit. Judges invoked his name before issuing verdicts, asking that their decisions align with his divine clarity. The image of Hammurabi receiving the rod and ring from Shamash on the great stela immortalized that connection, earthly judgment guided by celestial vision. Hammurabi's own writings echo this conviction. In the prologue to his code, he described himself as the king whom Shamash has endowed with justice and Marduk with wisdom. In the epilogue, he warned future rulers not to alter his laws. May the great gods, whose command cannot be changed, curse him who changes my words, confound his plans, and break his scepter. To tamper with the code was to offend the gods themselves. This made the law not only unbreakable, but eternal. Temples throughout the empire celebrated this divine partnership. At Nippur, the priests of Enlil acknowledged Marduk's supremacy, but retained their ancient rites, demonstrating how Hammurabi's order could absorb and harmonize older faiths. In Sippar, the temple of Shamash became a model of royal justice, housing scribes who copied the code and trained judges. In Borsippa, the sanctuary of Nabu, god of writing, was adorned with hymns praising the power of the written word, the same tool that carried Hammurabi's law across the realm. Religion and governance worked hand in hand, each legitimizing the other. Economic life mirrored this spiritual framework. Loans, trade, and contracts were often conducted under divine supervision. A merchant borrowing silver might swear before the statue of Ishtar, goddess of oaths and warfare, ensuring honesty by invoking her wrath. Farmers, leasing land, paid tithes to temples, linking productivity with piety. Even festivals carried administrative significance. During the New Year celebration, when Hammurabi took the hand of Marduk's statue, all debts and legal penalties suspended briefly, symbolizing renewal and forgiveness. The cycle of the year itself became a rhythm of law. Through these practices, Hammurabi turned religion into a vehicle for unity. In earlier centuries, cities had fought under rival gods, Ur for Nana, Uruk for Inanna, Kish for Zababa. Each temple stood as a fortress of local identity. Under Hammurabi, the pantheon reorganized itself under a single hierarchy, with Marduk at its summit. The gods of conquered cities were honored but subordinated. Their worship continued, but their loyalty was redefined. By merging theology with governance, Hammurabi created a religious empire as much as a political one. For the common people, this integration of divine and legal order offered both comfort and fear. To live righteously was to remain in harmony with the cosmos. To sin was to invite drought, plague, or defeat. When floods came or harvests failed, priests led rituals of atonement, reciting hymns that linked misfortune to moral imbalance. May the king establish justice, they prayed, that the rivers may rise and the fields bear fruit. Justice was not only a civic duty, it was the key to survival. The fusion of law and faith also inspired art and literature. Hymns composed in this era praised Hammurabi as the beloved of Marduk, the exalted shepherd who causes righteousness to shine. In temple schools, scribes copied and recited these hymns alongside the code itself, blurring the line between worship and education. Clay tablets from Babylon show passages of the law written as poetic verses, suggesting that students learned them through recitation as one might learn a prayer. Law had become scripture, a sacred text recited as devotion. Over time, the rituals surrounding judgment took on a grandeur equal to the temple ceremonies they mirrored. When a royal court convened, incense burned, and offerings were made before the verdict was read. The judge's stylus, dipped in ink, symbolized the divine rod of Shamash. Each sentence pronounced carried the echo of sacred authority. For those present, justice was not mere procedure, it was revelation. Through this synthesis, Hammurabi achieved something unprecedented. He had not only unified his empire through conquest and administration, but had woven its moral and spiritual fabric into one. Law was no longer a tool of rule. It was the reflection of creation itself. To disobey it was to rebel against the gods. To uphold it was to participate in divine order. As Babylon's priests chanted hymns to Marduk and Shamash, and judges inscribed their rulings on clay, the boundary between heaven and earth seemed to blur. Every verdict, every transaction, every oath reaffirmed the same truth. The gods had spoken, and their words were carved in stone. Under Hammurabi's rule, Babylon reached a brilliance that no city in Mesopotamia had ever achieved. The wars were over, the code was set, and the empire breathed in rhythm with the laws that sustained it. Order became prosperity, and prosperity became legend. The land between the rivers, once fractured by rivalry, now moved as one body. Its fields, temples, and trade routes aligned beneath a single crown. In this period of calm, the king's vision unfolded in full. He strengthened the canals that linked the north to the south, transforming them into arteries of wealth. Barges loaded with grain, wool, and copper glided along the waterways, passing under bridges newly rebuilt by royal engineers. The same rivers that had carried war now carried peace. Babylon grew rich from the tolls and taxes that flowed through its ports. Merchants from distant lands, Anatolia, the Levant, even the highlands of Elam brought their goods to its markets, where scribes recorded every transaction in precise cuneiform. The city itself reflected that prosperity. Towering walls of sun-baked brick encircled neighborhoods of workshops and temples. The great ziggurat of Marduk, known as Etemenanki, rose like a stairway between earth and sky. In its shadow sprawled Es-Sagila, the god's grand temple filled with incense, music, and prayer. Pilgrims arrived from every province to seek blessings, while delegations from conquered cities offered tribute. The hum of Babylon was a sound of confidence, a civilization at peace with itself, guided by faith in its law and in its king. Education flourished alongside commerce. The scribal schools established during Hammurabi's reforms became centers of learning for the empire. Students learned to write both Sumerian, the language of the gods, and Akkadian, the language of men. They copied hymns, contracts, and sections of the law code until the shapes of the cuneiform signs became second nature. Mathematics advanced as scribes developed tables for multiplication, division, and geometry. These calculations were not abstract. They were used to measure land, construct canals, and manage harvests. The science of numbers, born from the need for fairness and record-keeping, became a legacy that would endure long after the empire's fall. Astronomy, too, began to flourish under Babylon's watchful skies. Priests observed the movements of the stars and planets, seeking patterns that might reveal the intentions of the gods. The same discipline that had created law now reached toward heaven, measuring time and destiny through celestial order. Calendars were refined, festivals aligned with the lunar cycles, and the rhythm of the year reflected the precision of Hammurabi's governance. Artisans captured this spirit of harmony in their craft. Jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli adorned the nobles. Finely carved cylinder seals depicted scenes of worship and trade. Potters, metalworkers, and builders benefited from the empire's stability, their workshops humming beside the canals. Every product, from textiles to tools, bore the mark of a society that had mastered its environment. Culturally, the blending of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Amorite traditions reached a new equilibrium. The old Sumerian hymns were rewritten in the Akkadian tongue, preserving their poetry while renewing their meaning. Myths once sung in the temples of Ur and Lagash found new life in Babylon, where Marduk replaced older deities as the hero of creation. This cultural synthesis gave the empire a shared mythology, one that celebrated order triumphing over chaos, the same principle embodied in Hammurabi's law. The prosperity of the cities extended to the countryside. Farmers worked under predictable systems of irrigation and taxation. Royal inspectors ensured that canals remained clear and harvests were accurately recorded. When floods threatened, the state provided labor and materials for repair. Famine, once a constant specter in Mesopotamian life, receded. The people of Babylon came to believe that their king's justice had tamed not only men, but the elements themselves. This confidence shaped the empire's image abroad. Ambassadors from neighboring states came to Babylon's court seeking alliances and trade. Letters from distant rulers addressed Hammurabi with respect, often calling him the exalted king or the shepherd of the nations. His reputation extended far beyond his borders, carried by merchants and diplomats who spread tales of his wisdom and fairness. To foreigners, Babylon was not merely a power. It was a symbol of stability and enlightenment. Festivals reflected that grandeur. During the New Year celebrations, the city transformed into a theater of divine renewal. Statues of the gods from nearby temples were brought into Babylon, joining Marduk's procession through the streets. Priests chanted hymns that praised the cosmic order. Marduk has made firm the foundations of heaven and earth. Hammurabi, his servant, has made firm the hearts of men. Citizens filled the avenues, their songs echoing between the city walls. In those days of joy, ruler and ruled, divine and mortal, seemed to share one breath. The empire's wealth allowed Hammurabi to pursue monumental building projects. Temples across the realm were restored, bridges rebuilt, and fortifications strengthened. The king's inscriptions speak of his pride in these achievements. I raised high the walls of Sippar. I restored the sanctuaries of Nippur. I dug canals for the benefit of the people. Each act reinforced the sacred duty of kingship, to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and society. Amid prosperity, justice remained the empire's spine. Courts continued to operate in every province, following the code with diligence. Judges who deviated from its principles faced dismissal or punishment. The king's messengers traveled constantly, carrying reports of verdicts and appeals. When complex disputes reached the royal court, Hammurabi himself presided. One surviving record describes his arbitration in a boundary case between temple estates, a small matter by the standards of empire, but significant for what it revealed. The king never withdrew from the business of fairness. In the cities, law and faith merged into daily ritual. Merchants began their work with offerings to Marduk. Builders prayed to Shamash for clarity of conscience before construction. Families gathered at dusk to give thanks for peace and prosperity. The law was not seen as a constraint, but as a blessing, the invisible pattern that kept chaos at bay. The people no longer feared divine wrath so long as justice reigned. The combination of moral order and material success created a rare balance in history. Hammurabi's empire was not vast compared to later kingdoms, but its internal coherence made it shine brighter than its size would suggest. Roads were secure, harvests consistent, and justice predictable. Generations later, scribes would refer to this era simply as the time when righteousness prevailed. Even within this perfection, change was inevitable. The king was aging. The borders stretched farther than any single ruler could personally oversee. New challenges simmered beyond the horizon. Tribes from the north, envoys from distant highlands, and the ever-watchful Elamites. But within Babylon's walls, few could sense the gathering tension. The empire's golden years still glowed, a sunset whose beauty hid the coming night. Hammurabi's legacy was already forming, even as he lived. His monuments, his code, his canals, and his temples were not merely works of stone and earth. They were symbols of a vision fulfilled. The shepherd had become the lawgiver. The conqueror had become the teacher. Under his rule, the dream of unity that had eluded Mesopotamia for centuries was, for a time, reality. Soon the seasons would turn, as they always did. Empires rise and decline. Rivers flood and retreat. But in this moment, beneath the sun of Babylon, humanity had drawn closer than ever to the divine order it sought to mirror. Justice and prosperity walked side by side, and the king who had once ruled by might, now ruled by wisdom alone. The peace that Hammurabi had built seemed unshakable. Babylon stood at the center of a prosperous world, its rivers gleaming under the sun, its markets alive with the hum of trade. From the Persian Gulf to the northern plains, officials administered justice in the king's name, and every temple echoed with hymns to Marduk and Shamash. Yet beneath the surface of abundance, the slow erosion of empire had already begun. Success carried its own fragility. The same network of canals, roads, and provinces that bound the realm together also stretched it thin. As Hammurabi entered the later years of his reign, The weight of governing a vast and diverse empire began to show. Reports from distant provinces spoke of local disputes, unpaid taxes, and delayed shipments of grain. Governors who had once ruled efficiently now quarreled over boundaries or hoarded resources for themselves. The king, who had once traveled the land in person, now depended on messengers to keep his authority alive in faraway cities. Nature, too, began to test the limits of human order. Inscriptions from this period mention years of low rainfall and poor harvests, evidence echoed by modern studies of river sediment and pollen. Crops failed in the southern fields, forcing migrations northward. Irrigation canals, clogged by silt, overflowed or ran dry. The delicate balance that had fed Babylon's greatness began to falter. Hammurabi responded as he always had, with decrees, repairs, and remissions of debt. But the problems multiplied faster than they could be solved. External pressures mounted alongside internal strain. Beyond the eastern mountains, the restless Elamites watched for signs of weakness. To the north, new tribal groups from the Zagros and steppe, forebears of the Kassites, moved closer to Babylon's frontiers. Farther west, the Hittites were rising in Anatolia, forging alliances that would soon reshape the Near East. Though these powers did not yet threaten Babylon directly, their presence marked the end of the isolation that had sheltered Hammurabi's empire. The world was growing wider, and with it came new kinds of danger. Diplomatic letters from the later years of his reign show a shift in tone. The confident voice that once spoke of divine harmony now carried undertones of caution. Requests for tribute became reminders, and reminders became commands. Some vassal kings hesitated to respond, calculating whether Babylon's gaze still carried the same weight. The machinery of empire, so finely tuned in its youth, began to creak. Amid these challenges, Hammurabi's faith deepened. He turned increasingly to the temples for assurance and sought guidance from the omens interpreted by priests. The god Marduk remained his anchor, yet even divine favor required renewal. The annual New Year festival, once a celebration of triumph, took on the solemn air of ritual necessity. The king, now old and perhaps frail, was still carried through the streets to take the hand of Marduk's statue, reaffirming the covenant that bound man and God. To his people, he remained the king who made justice shine. But the brilliance was beginning to dim. Administrative correspondence from this time hints at weariness within the bureaucracy. In one letter, a governor complains that laborers have abandoned their work on a canal. In another, a temple official begs for silver to pay scribes whose wages are months overdue. Even the system of inspectors, the eyes of the king, could not keep pace with the growing complexity of the realm. The empire had become too large for a single mind to manage, even one as disciplined as Hammurabi's. Rebellions, though small, began to flicker along the borders. In the far south, discontent among the descendants of Larsa's nobility occasionally flared into open defiance. To the east, hill tribes tested Babylon's defenses. Hammurabi's armies, once swift and decisive, now moved slower, burdened by the empire's vast supply lines. Campaigns that had once lasted weeks stretched into months, draining resources and morale. Yet Hammurabi's response remained true to his nature. He ruled through law, not vengeance. Instead of raising rebellious towns, he replaced their leaders, issued new tax regulations, and reaffirmed the principles of justice. To the very end, he believed that order could be restored through reason and fairness. His final decrees focused on the same themes that had defined his reign: canal maintenance, debt forgiveness, and temple reconstruction. They read like echoes of his earlier triumphs. reminders of the ideals that had built Babylon's strength. Still, time was an adversary no decree could command. The king's health declined, and the vigor that had once animated every decision gave way to reflection. The chronicles of later generations describe an aging ruler who spent his days in consultation with priests and scribes, dictating letters from the palace and reviewing cases brought from the provinces. His presence remained commanding, but his steps grew slower. In public ceremonies, courtiers supported him as he walked, the living symbol of an empire growing old with its creator. In the evenings, processions of musicians played in the courtyards, their songs honoring both the king and the gods who had guided him. Hammurabi listened, surrounded by his family and advisors, while the lights of Babylon shimmered beyond the palace walls. The city was still magnificent, its canals full, its ziggurat gleaming under torchlight, but the calm held a weight that only those near the end could feel. The empire stood unchallenged, yet its future no longer seemed certain. Among the signs of strain was the emergence of new social pressures. The same prosperity that had enriched merchants and priests left farmers and laborers struggling to keep pace. Land consolidation by temples and elites created tensions that no law could entirely resolve. The king's code had envisioned a world of balanced justice, but the realities of empire had tilted that balance. In the outer provinces, where Babylon's oversight was weaker, local judges and governors often interpreted the laws to their own advantage. The ideal of fairness remained, but its practice wavered. Even so, Hammurabi never lost faith in his mission. His later inscriptions returned again and again to the language of service. He was the shepherd who provided pasture, the father who protected his children, the light that the gods had placed among men. Though the challenges of his later reign tested these metaphors, they also gave them depth. The shepherd now tended an aging flock. The father guided sons who would soon inherit his house. In this twilight of stability, Babylon still dazzled travelers. Foreign envoys wrote of its order and wealth, its libraries and temples, its markets filled with goods from distant lands. They could not see the fatigue beneath the surface, the aging king, the strained bureaucracy, the creeping drought. For them, Babylon remained a beacon, a place where law governed life and where justice was not an aspiration, but a daily fact. Hammurabi had brought his people closer to the divine order than any ruler before him, yet the same perfection that defined his empire made it vulnerable to time. Systems built on harmony falter when that harmony begins to fade. As the king grew old, the world around him shifted. The stars above Babylon still traced their familiar paths, but new constellations were rising beyond the horizon. The shepherd had fulfilled his purpose, but the flock was vast, and no single hand could guide it forever. What he had created, a kingdom of laws, temples, and memory, would soon have to stand without him. For now, however, Babylon remained at peace, the great city poised between the memory of triumph and the inevitability of change. The twilight of Hammurabi's reign arrived quietly, carried on the same slow currents that had once borne his triumphs. The empire was still intact, the temples still filled with offerings, the markets still busy with trade. But the pulse that had driven it all began to fade. For nearly 43 years, he had ruled a land that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the northern plains, binding its people through war, faith, and law. Now, his body weakened even as his legacy grew unshakable. Age was a rarity among Mesopotamian kings, yet Hammurabi lived long enough to witness both the glory and the limits of his design. In his later inscriptions, the tone softened. The king, who once spoke of conquest and cosmic order, now wrote of stewardship and gratitude. Marduk has entrusted the nations to me. I have guided them with justice and truth. His words carried less command and more reflection, as if the shepherd had paused to look back upon his field. The palace courtyards, once alive with military councils and building projects, now filled with priests, scribes, and physicians. Royal letters from these final years mention frequent offerings to Shamash and Marduk, prayers for health, and gifts to temples in gratitude for long life. Some accounts suggest that he suffered from an illness of the joints or lungs, an affliction that confined him to the palace but did not silence his mind. Even in frailty, he continued to govern through correspondence, dictating orders to officials and reviewing judgments from across the empire. Succession had already been arranged. His son, Samsu-Iluna, had served as co-regent in the later years, learning the machinery of rule under his father's watchful eye. Records from provincial archives bear both their names, proof that the transition of power was planned, not forced. In one inscription, Hammurabi refers to his heir as the son of my body, chosen by Marduk to continue righteousness. The continuity of justice, not the perpetuation of bloodline alone, was his final wish. In the capital, daily life continued with reverent normalcy. The canals ran full, the temples gleamed, and the scribes in their schools still copied his laws onto fresh tablets for study. Yet whispers spread through the streets of the king's weakness, of omens in the stars. Babylonian priests, masters of divination, examined the sky each night. A pale halo around the moon was seen as a sign of transition. Birds flying low over the river foretold the end of an age. In their coded reports to the palace, they spoke cautiously. The light of the shepherd wanes, yet his law endures. When the end came, it likely came with dignity. No chronicler describes a violent death or palace intrigue. The king, who had ruled for more than 4 decades, slipped away amid prayers and incense. His passing was recorded simply, perhaps deliberately understated, for no words could capture the weight of his departure. In Babylonian custom, death was not an ending, but a return to the divine order. The man who had received justice from Shamash now joined the realm of the gods who had guided him. Across the empire, mourning spread like a slow tide. In temples from Ur to Sippar, priests draped statues in dark cloth. The festival of Marduk was replaced by laments for his chosen servant. Scribes composed hymns, celebrating his life and invoking blessings on his successor. He who made justice shine has gone to the light. May his son continue his truth. Farmers left offerings at canal banks. Soldiers stood in silence at the city gates, and families recited prayers that spoke of gratitude more than grief. The royal funeral, as later texts suggest, followed the ancient rites reserved for kings who had become legend. The body was purified with water from the Euphrates, anointed with oils, and wrapped in linen. Musicians played harps and flutes, as priests recited invocations to guide his spirit through the underworld. At the entrance to his tomb, likely within Babylon itself, stood an inscription dedicating him to Marduk, the king who made the weak stand firm, who established justice in the land, rests here in eternal light. Hammurabi's death marked the close of an age that historians would later call the First Dynasty's zenith. Yet for his subjects, it felt less like an ending than a transformation. The empire he had built remained stable, at least for the moment. Samsu-Iluna ascended the throne without bloodshed, guided by his father's advisors and the unifying presence of the law. Babylon continued to function, its institutions too strong to collapse overnight. but the sense of invulnerability, the belief that the king's wisdom could solve every problem, died with him. In the years immediately following his death, scribes preserved his memory with unusual devotion. Temple hymns praised him as the King of Righteousness, the light of the land, and the shepherd who walked with the gods. These titles, once political propaganda, had become genuine reverence. In classrooms, his code was copied not as mere law, but as sacred literature. Young scribes learned its clauses as they once learned prayers, their styluses pressing his words into clay with almost religious precision. For Hammurabi's contemporaries, his passing confirmed a truth that his life had embodied. Justice, once revealed, could outlive its messenger. The stela in the temple courtyard remained untouched, its surface gleaming under the sun. Citizens continued to pass it daily, reading the lines that had shaped their lives. Even as the man was mourned, the law stood unbroken. His authority had become institutional, woven into the habits of courts and markets. The empire mourned, but it did not falter. The new king, Samsu-iluna, inherited not only a throne, but a moral inheritance. His father's code became both his shield and his burden. He could rule in its shadow, but never escape it. Every decree he issued, every judgment he pronounced, was measured against the standards set in stone. For a time, this continuity kept Babylon's heart steady. The people believed that Hammurabi's spirit still guided his heir, whispering through the written words of the law. Still, even in this period of reverent stability, the seeds of decline were being sown. The unity Hammurabi had imposed began to loosen. Provinces tested the limits of royal patience, and new powers gathered strength beyond the horizon. But these shadows belonged to the future. For now, the memory of the lawgiver was luminous. His presence felt in every act of justice, every hymn of gratitude, every grain of order that remained. The shepherd who had led his people from chaos to harmony was gone, but his work endured. The empire he forged would change and crumble, rebuilt and renamed by generations yet unborn. The laws carved into basalt would travel farther than any army, surviving even when his city lay in ruins. Hammurabi had sought to make the strong not oppress the weak. In doing so, he had given humanity one of its first glimpses of universal justice. As night fell over Babylon and torches flickered on the temple steps, priests intoned the final prayer of mourning. Their words rose through the still air, mingling with the wind that swept across the canals. May the King of Righteousness dwell among the gods. May his law never fade. May his name be spoken as long as the rivers flow. The shepherd of Babylon had laid down his staff, but his light, reflected in the stone of his code, would never be extinguished. When Hammurabi's tomb was sealed and the songs of mourning faded, the empire he had built stood poised between endurance and decay. The structures of order remained, courts still judged, canals still flowed, and merchants still filled the markets. But the living force that had sustained them was gone. His son, Samsu-iluna, inherited a kingdom at its greatest extent and its most fragile balance. At first, continuity seemed assured. The young king maintained his father's ministers, upheld the code, and renewed the rituals of Marduk's temple. Royal proclamations promised stability. The law would remain untouched, the gods appeased, and justice preserved. For a few years, Babylon prospered in the shadow of Hammurabi's memory. Provinces sent their tributes without hesitation, and envoys addressed Samsu-iluna as the rightful heir to the shepherd of the peoples. But the stillness was deceptive. The empire's vastness, once its strength, now became its burden. The first fractures appeared in the south. The cities of Ur, Uruk, and Isin, long accustomed to local autonomy, grew restless under Babylonian taxation. Without Hammurabi's personal authority to bind them, loyalty thinned. Old elites who had bowed in his presence began to reclaim independence. In the archives of Ur, scribes recorded the emergence of rival kings, each invoking ancient gods to legitimize rebellion. Samsu-Iluna responded with force, marching south to suppress the uprisings. The campaigns were long and bitter. Babylonian garrisons retook the cities, but at heavy cost. The very lands that had once supplied grain and silver to the empire now lay in ruin. To the east, the old menace of Elam revived. Its rulers, emboldened by Babylon's distraction, launched raids across the Tigris Valley. Small towns were looted and prisoners carried beyond the mountains. Samsu-Iluna's forces retaliated, but struggled to maintain long supply lines. The memory of Hammurabi's organized campaigns faded amid exhaustion and confusion. The empire that had once projected confidence began to fight merely to preserve its boundaries. The north fared little better. In the highlands beyond the Diyala River, a new people stirred, the Kassites. Originally nomadic herders, they moved steadily into Mesopotamian territory, filling the vacuum left by Babylon's overextension. At first, they came as traders and mercenaries. Later, as settlers and conquerors. Their rise was gradual but relentless, a slow erosion rather than an invasion. Babylon's officials reported their movements but lacked the resources to expel them. Amid these external threats, internal strain deepened. Years of war and rebuilding had exhausted the treasury. The intricate system of irrigation that had made the land fertile demanded constant maintenance, and without Hammurabi's disciplined oversight, it began to fail. Silt-clogged canals and fields turned barren. Famine returned to areas that had not known hunger for decades. The people, once united by prosperity, now looked to local leaders for relief rather than to the distant crown. Samsu-Iluna's decrees tried to recapture his father's voice. He issued remissions of debt, rebuilt temples, and reaffirmed the authority of the code. But his words lacked the resonance of those carved in stone. Where Hammurabi's reforms had flowed from vision, his sons echoed necessity. Rebellion broke out again in the south. This time, it spread faster. Armies that once fought for empire now fought for survival. The long struggle ended with the destruction of several southern cities, Ur and Uruk among them, by Babylon's own forces. The victory was hollow. The breadbasket of Mesopotamia lay in ashes, its people scattered. Farther north, the situation deteriorated just as swiftly. Eshnunna and Mari, once centers of Babylonian administration, faded into obscurity. Trade routes shifted, bypassing the empire's heartland. The balance that had allowed Hammurabi to unify the land between the rivers was gone. Babylon remained rich in name, but its wealth no longer reached its edges. The empire had become an island of stability, surrounded by gathering storms. Then came the blow that would end Babylon's supremacy. Around 1595 BC, nearly a century after Hammurabi's birth, a foreign army descended from the northwest. The Hittites, led by their king Mursili I, crossed the Euphrates with speed and precision. Their campaign was not one of conquest, but of plunder. Babylon's defenses, neglected after years of internal turmoil, could not withstand the assault. The city was sacked, its temples desecrated, its treasures carried away. Among the spoils was the great stela of the law taken to the city of Susa, in distant Elam, where it would lie buried for millennia. The fall of Babylon shocked the world of Mesopotamia. For the first time in generations, the center of civilization lay broken. The Hittites withdrew almost immediately, leaving a void that others rushed to fill. Into that void stepped the Kassites, whose tribes gradually settled the devastated lands. They brought with them a new language and culture, but adopted much of Babylon's structure. The institutions Hammurabi had created, his bureaucracy, his religion, his law, proved more enduring than his dynasty. Under Kassite rule, Babylon was rebuilt, its temples reopened, its ziggurats restored, and its name reclaimed as a symbol of continuity. Though the new rulers traced their lineage to distant hills, they embraced Hammurabi's legacy to legitimize their authority. They called themselves servants of Marduk, keepers of the law, inheritors of the divine covenant. Through them, the spirit of the old empire lived on, reshaped but unbroken. Babylonian unity broke apart, yet what followed was transformation, not erasure. Hammurabi's dream survived the ruin. Law remained the thread that bound the region's peoples together, even as power shifted from dynasty to dynasty. In every rebuilt temple, copies of his code were studied. In every court, echoes of his judgments guided decisions. His name became less that of a man and more that of an era, the measure of what justice could be. The Stela's journey mirrored the fate of his empire. Carried off to Susa, it survived the rise and fall of kingdoms that never knew its maker. When future rulers read its inscriptions, they recognized in its words a wisdom beyond conquest. Even in exile, it continued to rule, not through armies or tribute, but through the idea that law could outlast time. By the close of the 17th century before Christ, Babylon had lost its empire, but not its soul. Its walls had fallen, yet its culture spread farther than ever, influencing every kingdom that followed. From the Kassites who rebuilt the city to the Assyrians who later admired it, each successor found in Hammurabi's legacy a model for order. What perished in fire was reborn in memory. When travelers approached the ruins of old Babylon, generations later, they still spoke of the king who had made justice shine. The canals he had dug were filled with silt, and the palaces he built had turned to dust, but his words endured, preserved on tablets, recited in schools, remembered in prayers. The city that once ruled all of Mesopotamia had become a symbol of something greater than power. The belief that human life, even in its rise and fall, could reflect the harmony of the gods. The empire's unity was gone, its crown scattered, but the idea that Hammurabi had carved into stone refused to die. Long after Hammurabi's empire had vanished, the echo of his laws continued to shape the ancient world. Kingdoms rose and fell along the Tigris and Euphrates, yet each new ruler found himself standing in the shadow of Babylon's great lawgiver. His stela, though carried away as plunder to distant Susa, survived as both relic and teacher. The black basalt still bore the image of the king before the god of justice, as if reminding the ages that no conquest could erase the word of law once it had been carved into stone. In the centuries that followed Babylon's fall, scribes across Mesopotamia continued to copy and study Hammurabi's code. Clay fragments from later dynasties preserve his preamble and laws, written out as exercises for students in the temple schools of Nippur, Borsippa, and Sippar. The code had become more than legislation. It was a sacred text, part of the curriculum by which scribes learned not only how to write, but how to think. To them, Hammurabi was not merely a historical figure, but the archetype of the just ruler, the man who had captured divine order in human words. Under the Kassites, who rebuilt Babylon after its ruin, the law retained authority. These foreign kings, eager to legitimize their rule, called themselves guardians of Hammurabi's justice. They restored the temples of Marduk and Shamash and upheld the forms of Babylonian administration. Even as language and customs changed, the moral architecture of the empire remained intact. The Kassites built their legitimacy on continuity, declaring that the spirit of Hammurabi still watched over the land. In their inscriptions, they echoed his phrases, calling themselves shepherds of the people and beloved of Marduk. The imitation was deliberate. To rule Babylon was to inherit its law. As centuries passed, the torch of Mesopotamian culture passed to Assyria. The kings of Nineveh and Ashur, fierce in war yet meticulous in record-keeping, preserved much of Babylon's heritage. Among the tablets in their libraries, copies of Hammurabi's code were studied by scholars seeking precedent for royal decrees. The Assyrians issued their own collections of law, often echoing Babylonian phrases or refining old statutes. Though harsher in tone, these later codes still bore the unmistakable imprint of Hammurabi's principles: proportional justice, responsibility in trade, and the protection of the weak from the strong. The idea that divine order could be expressed through written law had become an inheritance shared by all Mesopotamia. In temples throughout the region, priests recited the prologue of Hammurabi's code as a hymn to justice. The words that once introduced the laws, praising Anu, Enlil, and Marduk for granting kingship, became part of liturgy. In these chants, Hammurabi's role was not that of conqueror, but mediator, the mortal who had brought the wisdom of heaven to earth. His reign became mythic, a golden age when the gods had walked with kings and righteousness illuminated the world. Babylon itself would rise again. Centuries after Hammurabi, under the Neo-Babylonian dynasty of Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, the city regained its splendor. Great walls encircled it once more, and the ziggurat Etemenanki soared skyward like a rebuilt mountain. Yet even in this new age of empire, the kings who ruled from Babylon invoked the name of Hammurabi as the foundation of their legitimacy. They described themselves as heirs to the king who made justice shine, using his image to connect their power with divine tradition. The empire might have changed, but the principle remained the same. The ruler was the servant of law, not its master. By this time, Hammurabi's actual code had already traveled far beyond the city of its birth. Fragments found in Assyrian archives and later in Hittite lands show that the spirit of his laws influenced neighboring civilizations. Trade and diplomacy carried Babylonian ideas across the Near East, and with them came the notion that governance required more than strength. It required balance. The ancient belief that the gods had entrusted humanity with justice became a regional creed. From it, later cultures drew their own versions of equity and punishment, each adapting the principle to its own time. When scholars, in later centuries, compiled the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian law codes, they cited Hammurabi by name. In one tablet, a scribe remarks, "As in the time of the righteous king of Babylon, so shall judgment be rendered." His name had become synonymous with justice itself. The code was no longer merely a historical relic, but a timeless standard, a mirror in which every ruler measured his virtue. Even after the final decline of Mesopotamian civilization, Hammurabi's ideas endured through cultural memory. The biblical traditions of law, emerging centuries later, reflected echoes of the same moral structure: measured retribution, protection of the poor, and divine sanction for justice. The phrase, "an eye for an eye," often cited as harsh, began as an attempt to limit vengeance rather than inflame it, a principle first articulated clearly in Hammurabi's world. His concept of law as the balance between offense and restitution would echo in countless systems that followed, from the edicts of the Hittites to the ordinances of the Hebrews. Meanwhile, the stela itself, once the centerpiece of Babylon, rested in silence at Susa. Time buried it beneath the dust of collapsing empires. There it lay unseen for more than 3,000 years, its script preserved in the darkness. When it was rediscovered in 1901 by French excavators, the world once again heard Hammurabi's voice. Scholars in Paris translated the cuneiform and realized they were reading the most complete law code of the ancient world. The same prologue that had been sung in temples now spoke across ages, that the strong may not oppress the weak. Its rediscovery did more than revive an ancient text. It resurrected a worldview, the idea that justice was divine, measurable, and universal had never entirely vanished, but Hammurabi's code gave it a tangible origin. Historians recognized it as the first known attempt to unify morality and administration, turning divine order into public law. The stela became a symbol not only of Babylon, but of civilization itself. In museums, its image stands as an icon of the human desire to govern through fairness rather than fear. For modern readers, Hammurabi's code still provokes reflection. It reveals a world both distant and familiar, a society rigid in class but rich in conscience, a ruler both devout and pragmatic. Beneath its severity lies the earliest articulation of a question that would haunt every generation after. How can power be just? Hammurabi answered it with faith, that justice, to endure, must come from a source higher than kings. His world has vanished, his empire reduced to ruins, yet his voice remains clear. On the stela's dark surface, he still stands before the radiant god, one hand raised in reverence, the other extended to receive the symbols of rule. The scene is silent, but its meaning endures. Authority is a covenant, and justice is its breath. The rivers that once carried Hammurabi's armies now wind through deserts and cities that bear other names. The temples have crumbled, and the gods have faded into myth. But the principle, born in Babylon, the belief that law can bring harmony to the world, still courses through human history. Each court that weighs fairness, each ruler who seeks legitimacy and justice, walks a path first marked by the shepherd of the two rivers. The empire of Babylon is gone, but its foundation endures wherever justice is spoken. Hammurabi's stone, carved under the light of Shamash, remains the silent witness to humanity's oldest promise, that order can rise from chaos, and that the voice of the law can outlast the empires of men.